It usually starts not with an explosion, not with an order, not even with a threat, but with a phrase that sounds oddly out of place. A sentence spoken too calmly for the weight it carries. A time frame mentioned as if it were routine. 2 weeks, 2 months. A window so specific that it immediately raises a more troubling question. Why does anyone feel confident enough to say this out loud at all? At moments like this, the problem is rarely the prediction itself. The problem is what must already be happening behind the scenes for such certainty to exist. When senior military figures begin to speak in intervals instead of hypotheticals, it usually means that the decision-making process has moved past debate and into sequencing, not whether something will happen, but how fast the remaining pieces can be aligned without the structure collapsing too early. On the surface, everything still looks familiar. Naval warnings in contested waters, aircraft adjusting their patrol patterns, official statements carefully balanced between deterrence and restraint. Nothing that, taken alone, would justify alarm. Yet the tone has shifted in a way that is difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. The language is no longer about red lines, it is about timing. At the same time, something else begins to feel wrong, almost embarrassingly mundane. Documents appear and disappear, statements are issued and quietly removed. Words like discipline and loyalty are suddenly paired with punishments that do not need to be spelled out. When an organization warns its own members not to think, not to hesitate, not to disobey, it is rarely projecting strength. It is trying to seal cracks that have already formed. What makes this moment unsettling is not the presence of pressure from the outside, but the suspicion that the pressure inside is becoming harder to control. Systems built for confrontation are surprisingly fragile when faced with hesitation from within. Armies are trained to absorb losses, but they are not designed to process doubt. And doubt, once it spreads, does not announce itself loudly. It moves quietly, through delays, through refusals framed as misunderstandings, through absences that are never fully explained. At this point, the story stops being about ships and jets and starts revolving around something far less visible: confidence, or rather, the absence of it. When leadership begins to fear its own enforcement mechanisms, the entire structure changes its behavior. Decisions become more centralized, orders become harsher, messaging becomes erratic, and paradoxically, the more aggressively control is asserted, the more obvious it becomes that control is slipping. There is also the matter of coordination, not cooperation in the abstract, but detailed synchronization that suggests prior assumptions have been discarded. Military planners do not casually compare timelines unless they expect those timelines to intersect. When discussions shift from general readiness to specific scenarios, it usually means that contingency planning is no longer theoretical. The uncomfortable part is that such coordination often accelerates precisely when one side believes the other is least capable of responding coherently. Meanwhile, the streets tell a different story. What began as localized unrest has started to resemble something harder to categorize. Not a single event, not a single demand, but a pattern that repeats itself across geography and time. Grief becomes mobilization. Memorials turn into gatherings. Silence transforms into presence. This is not the kind of movement that can be dismantled by removing a leader or blocking a channel. It feeds on accumulation, not direction. And this is where the main thing begins, although it is rarely acknowledged directly. A state can survive protests. It can survive sanctions. It can even survive military pressure. What it struggles to survive is simultaneity. Pressure from outside arriving just as cohesion inside begins to fail. When these curves overlap, the margin for error disappears. The most revealing signs are often the ones meant to reassure. Claims that loyalty remains absolute. Assertions that defections are impossible. Declarations that discipline will be enforced decisively. These statements are not aimed at adversaries. They are aimed inward. They are reminders, not warnings. And reminders are only necessary when memory is already fading. There is a reason why certain phrases are deleted after publication. Not because they were inaccurate, but because they revealed too much about the fear behind them. Panic is not always loud. Sometimes it is procedural. Sometimes it is a line of text that should never have been written in the first place. The question then is no longer simply whether a strike will occur within a given window. The more disturbing question is why that window exists at all. Why now feels different from every other moment of tension that preceded it. why confidence is being expressed at the same time discipline is being threatened, and why coordination appears to be intensifying precisely as internal stability becomes harder to guarantee. At this stage, nothing has officially broken. No point of no return has been announced. Everything remains technically reversible. But systems rarely fail at the moment of maximum pressure. They fail at the moment when everyone involved starts acting as if failure is already being accounted for. And when planning begins to assume collapse as a variable rather than an outcome, the story quietly enters a far more dangerous phase. From that point onward, the logic changes. What had looked like parallel crises begin to intersect, not by coincidence, but by design. Systems under stress stop behaving defensively and start prioritizing predictability over stability. When leadership no longer believes it can fully manage internal reactions, it begins to treat external escalation as a way to impose structure on chaos. This is counterintuitive, but it happens often enough to be recognizable. The internal security apparatus responds first. Authority is compressed upward. Discretion at lower levels is removed. Commanders are granted extraordinary latitude, not because they are trusted, but because there is no time left to manage nuance. Harshness becomes a substitute for coherence. Orders are simplified, enforcement is accelerated, and ambiguity is treated as a threat in itself. At this point, obedience matters more than effectiveness. Inside such a system, loyalty stops being an assumption and becomes a metric. It is monitored, tested, and enforced. The problem is that loyalty measured under pressure is no longer loyalty, but fear. Fear can hold a structure together for a time, but it also amplifies every mistake. One refusal becomes a precedent. One disappearance becomes a rumor. One leaked document becomes a signal. The system reacts not to events, but to the possibility that events might spiral beyond its ability to respond. This is where the external dimension becomes critical. Military coordination accelerates not because victory is guaranteed, but because delay increases uncertainty. Planning under these conditions shifts from deterrence to sequencing. Targets are discussed not in isolation, but in relation to internal thresholds. The question is no longer how much force is required, but when force will interact most effectively with internal strain. This is a deeply uncomfortable calculation, and it is rarely acknowledged publicly. At the same time, economic and political signals begin to align in ways that appear technical but carry psychological weight. Designations, restrictions, and isolations are framed as legal necessities, yet their real impact is cumulative erosion. They do not break a system overnight. They narrow its room for maneuver. They force elites to make private calculations about exposure, exit, and survival. Money moves first, then families, then silence. This silent movement is often misread as exaggeration or rumor, but it follows a familiar pattern. When those closest to power begin to hedge against continuity, the system enters a feedback loop. Protective measures signal vulnerability. Vulnerability invites further pressure. Pressure accelerates internal fragmentation. Fragmentation justifies harsher control, and harsher control confirms the original fear that cohesion can no longer be assumed. What makes this phase particularly unstable is the asymmetry between appearance and function. From the outside, the state still speaks in absolutes. From the inside, it operates on contingency. Plans are layered with fallback options, chains of command are shortened, redundancies are removed, not because they are inefficient, but because they introduce delay. Everything becomes faster, sharper, and less tolerant of error. Meanwhile, opposition does not need to coordinate centrally. It only needs to persist. Each act of suppression creates its own echo. Each funeral generates its own momentum. The system finds itself trapped between escalation and restraint, knowing that restraint emboldens resistance, while escalation feeds the very cycle it is trying to extinguish. This is the point at which the apparatus begins to consume itself operationally, even if it remains intact institutionally. Externally, planners observe these dynamics closely, not with sympathy, but with calculation. A state under internal strain reacts differently to pressure. Its thresholds shift. Its responses become less predictable. Retaliation becomes more symbolic than strategic. This creates both risk and opportunity. Risk because miscalculation becomes more likely. Opportunity, because decisive action may encounter less coordinated resistance than expected. But there is a limit to how much instability can be exploited before it turns uncontrollable. This is the line no one wants to cross openly, yet everyone is aware of its existence. Push too early and the system rallies. Push too late and the collapse becomes chaotic, producing outcomes no one planned for. The window, therefore, is not arbitrary. It is the narrow space between consolidation and disintegration. At this stage, no single actor fully controls the trajectory. Decisions are made under incomplete information, filtered through fear, ambition, and institutional inertia. Each move narrows the options available to the next decision maker. And while nothing irreversible has yet occurred, the margin for reversal is shrinking rapidly. What remains unresolved is not whether pressure will continue, but whether the structure can absorb one more shock without triggering a chain reaction it can no longer contain. From here, the consequences are no longer abstract. They unfold in real time, unevenly, without a clean sequence. The system does not collapse all at once. It begins to malfunction in specific places, at specific moments, where pressure converges faster than control can be restored. What follows is not a single decisive break, but a series of irreversible adjustments that quietly redefine what power still means. The first failure appears in predictability. Commands are issued, but their execution becomes inconsistent. Some units comply instantly, others hesitate, others comply selectively. This is not rebellion in the classical sense. It is fragmentation of response. A system designed for uniform action starts producing asymmetry. And asymmetry in a coercive structure is corrosive. Every deviation forces leadership to escalate oversight, which further slows reaction time and increases the risk of contradictory orders. At the same time, the external environment hardens, retaliatory options narrow, strategic signaling replaces strategic flexibility. Actions that once served as deterrence begin to function as commitments, locking actors into paths they did not originally intend to take. At this point, even restraint carries consequences. Not acting is interpreted as weakness. Acting risks triggering responses that cannot be calibrated once set in motion. Internally, the cost of control rises sharply. Surveillance expands, enforcement intensifies, and loyalty tests become routine. This does not stabilize the structure. It exhausts it. Resources are diverted from defense to internal management. Professional hierarchies give way to political reliability. Competence becomes secondary to obedience. Over time, this degrades operational capacity in ways that cannot be repaired quickly, even if the pressure were to ease. Meanwhile, the population adapts. Fear does not disappear, but it changes shape. It becomes collective, shared, and therefore less paralyzing. Public rituals of mourning transform into acts of defiance, not because they are organized, but because they are unavoidable. Death creates visibility. Visibility creates momentum. Momentum forces the system into a choice it has been trying to postpone: suppress harder and accelerate decay, or restrain and risk losing control altogether. Externally, planners now face their own point of no return. Interventions designed to exploit weakness begin to generate second-order effects. Infrastructure damage amplifies humanitarian strain. Humanitarian strain accelerates political fragmentation. Political fragmentation increases the probability of unplanned actors entering the field. At that stage, escalation is no longer a decision. It is a condition. This is the moment where scenarios multiply faster than they can be managed. Partial collapse invites internal power struggles. Security forces begin acting autonomously under the banner of preservation. Civil institutions hollow out. International responses lag behind events, always reacting to the previous phase while the next one is already unfolding. What was once a controlled pressure campaign turns into an environment where outcomes are shaped by momentum rather than intent. There is no clean end state here, no guaranteed transition, no stable successor waiting in the wings. The most likely result is a prolonged zone of instability in which authority exists, but legitimacy does not, and force is available, but coordination is not. In such conditions, even decisive victories lose their meaning because there is no system left capable of absorbing them. What makes this phase especially dangerous is that everyone involved understands what is at stake, yet no one retains full agency. Each actor operates within narrowing constraints, responding to signals that are delayed, distorted, or deliberately obscured. The space for strategic correction closes quietly, without announcement. From the outside, it may still look like a crisis approaching resolution. From the inside, it feels like something already slipping past the point where resolution is possible. The system continues to function, but only in form. The substance has begun to erode. And when erosion reaches that stage, the question is no longer how this ends, but how much of the surrounding order it takes with it before it does.